Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming, and welcome to Dr. Marco Lambertini, the Director General of WWF International. We're here to spend a little time talking about sustainable agriculture and how to pursue it in a post-2020 world. And Dr. Lambertini, let's just start on what 2020 was like for you. What were your expectations coming into this year, and how did you adjust along the way as the pandemic occurred?
Thank you very much, Eric. A pleasure to be having this conversation with you. Well, 2020 has been a year of tragedy, of disruption, but also deep learning, I would say. And I think that probably applies to all of us. A lot of our activities as WWF have been disrupted, but we've been able to adapt in terms of maintaining our program on the field in safety, and as well maintaining our connections with key stakeholders that we advocate, we try to influence in terms of moving towards more sustainable practices, companies, governments, and peer organizations. So all in all, I have to say, personally, I've learned a lot. I've learned that we don't need to travel that much as we used to do in the past, and probably I will never go back to that routine. And I learned also that virtually we can still connect, communicate, and perhaps even be more efficient than in person. So there's been disruption in many ways, but also some very interesting learning that will make us get back to a new normal when all this is gone.
Interesting. Before we go a little bit further into WWF's work, maybe we should take a moment just on some definitions here. You know, like sustainable agriculture, sustainable food. It's one of these phrases that can be tossed around a lot without anyone really taking time to define specifically what it means. So, what does it mean?
But listen, in a simple way, sustainable agriculture, sustainable food systems are a way to produce food within the limits of the planet. Something that today we are not doing. Today, it is blatantly obvious that the way we're producing food and consuming food and wasting food, by the way, it's totally unsustainable, it's inequitable, and it's just cannot continue for much longer. So there is actually, and that's the exciting part, this realization and recognition that something significant had to change in transition.
Mm-hmm. And what are the elements? Are there practices? Are there policies? You know, what are the top 3 to 5 sort of line items in national or international programs to achieve some of these goals?
Obviously, there are 3 key dimensions to achieving sustainable food systems. The first one is producing sustainably, so reducing the footprint of food production. The second one is consuming sustainably, so incentivizing production of sustainable food by consumer choice. And that's a super important dimension, and very often is not discussed in depth enough. And the third one, of course, as I mentioned earlier, we are today wasting and losing 1/3 of the food we produce. And so we got to find a way to just cut the waste dramatically. So these are the 3 key approaches. And then in each of these, you have different exciting emerging practices. In production, for example, there is a lot of attention now given to so-called agroecology or sustainable precision agriculture that intends to have much less inputs and versus the outputs of production. There's an interesting concept of regenerative agriculture, which is an agriculture that in a way reassess and revamp even old traditional ways of growing crops in terms of having more diversified crops at the same time, perhaps sometimes even agroforestry, so agriculture and forestry in many climate regions of the world. So there are plenty of new ways of doing what I mentioned earlier. Produce more food with less input, less energy, less water, less land, less chemicals, and as a consequence, better food, healthier food, and food that has a lower footprint on the environment.
One of the things that's been so harrowing to watch and experience in 2020 is to see how nations responded to the pandemic, and consequently how their food systems responded with either robustness or not enough robustness. And I wonder, given the three-pronged strategy you just mentioned, what have we learned from the pandemic about how enormous, unprecedented stress on a food system can reveal things that work and things that don't work about them?
Well, obviously, the pandemic has been an extreme stress test, not just for the food system, but for our trade system, for our societies as they are structured and work. So I wouldn't say that the food system has been particularly affected compared to other dimensions of our economy and society. And I think it's interesting to reflect how economies that have been less dependent on trade of their food, depending on trade for their food security, has probably been more resilient than the ones that, of course, are more dependent. That's an obvious conclusion, right? Because clearly, trade was one of the systems most affected by the COVID crisis. But what I think last year has really, or this year rather, is really taught us is, on one hand, that we can't take nature in natural system for granted anymore, and the pandemic it's brought into focus our broken relationship with the planet. Whether you talk about food system, or energy system, or the way we move millions of wild animals in illegal wildlife trade every year, all these activities are exposing us to dangers that now are clear in many more people than ever before. And that's just creating a new awareness, a new awakening that I think is leading to the potential super year for sustainable development and environmental of 2021.
2020 was supposed to be the big year. It was supposed to be a big year for climate negotiations, the Glasgow talks being pushed back to next year, and 2020 being a big year for the next stages of the evolution of the Paris Agreement. We were supposed to see a big set of negotiations in Kunming, China, also pushed back to next year. What can we now expect from these talks coming after 2020? What are the elements of agreements, that you'd like to see are common to both climate change and biodiversity, and, if it's not too much to ask, a sustainable food system?
Right. So what to expect from 2021? More than 2020. And I think we should expect more for two reasons. First of all, because COVID has taught us a big lesson. And I think we need to now absolutely reflect this lesson in the agreements of next year's Convention on Climate and Convention on Biodiversity. But also, let's remember, next year there will be also a first treaty on the ocean, particularly the high seas, the waters beyond national jurisdiction. And there will also be a very exciting Secretary General-led food summit at the UN week in September next year. So a number of strands are coming together. So we need to expect more. We need to expect more ambition. We need to expect clearer targets. On climate, we need to see nature-based solutions better embedded in the national determined contributions that we'll be discussing in Glasgow next year, as conservation and restoration of forests, mangroves, wetlands, marine habitats are all playing a fundamental role in mitigating and adapting to climate change. So we need to have more of that in the agreement next year, more than we had in Paris. And clear targets on economic sectors, particularly food system, that are so important in terms of emissions. The food system accounts from production, processing, distribution, consumption, accounts for over 30% of greenhouse gas emissions. So there is no way to achieve a Paris Agreement target and the 1.5 target if we don't fix the food system and reduce the footprint. On nature, we're a bit behind, I think, than climate, but that's where we have opportunity to catch up with a clarity of direction. This is something I'm very excited, Eric, about. I'm very, very, very obsessed almost, because for climate, we really have a clear direction of travel and a clear destination. We must be carbon neutral by 2050. and half emission by 2030. So we need to be on a journey of net zero emissions and reaching that target in 2050. On nature, we still don't have that clarity, and we need that clarity. And for us, something that goes in hand with carbon neutrality, the carbon neutral goal, net zero emissions, is a nature positive goal. Net zero loss of nature, which is what we are proposing to hit as a global target by 2030. And this is what science is asking us to do, to avoid biodiversity and ecosystem decline and even some regional level collapse.
What does that look like on the ground, net zero loss of nature by 2050? I mean, what parts of the world will be most sensitive to the changes need to happen to accomplish that?
Everywhere in the world, because biodiversity by definition is spread across the planet. But of course, there are places more important than others. But we know what these places are. We know there is a clear map of so-called key biodiversity areas if you focus on biodiversity. And there are increasingly clear maps about natural places that actually not only have a value on biodiversity, but also have values in terms of ecosystem services. Habitats that sequester a lot of carbon, habitats that are critical in regulating water flows, habitats that are fundamental in terms of coastal protection, like mangroves. So we know exactly what needs to be safeguarded, and that's why I think the global goal of nature positive and net zero loss by 2030, and then starting restoring what we lost, so we enter in a true nature positive economy and society, needs to then be declined and translated into concrete goals, concrete targets with a measurable, with a timeline. We suggest 2030. That, for example, is about more protection. We need to protect more of the existing natural places, forests, wetlands, ocean habitats. Many say 30% at least of the planet. Today, less than 8% of the ocean is protected, less than 15% of the land is protected. We need to step up through governments, through private ventures, so indigenous communities, local communities-led conservation. So that's a first big target. Second target, we got to stop the overexploitation of living organisms. On land, wildlife trade; in the ocean, overfishing. And the last part, which is the trickiest part, but actually the more important and perhaps the more transformational, is to really green, starting from greening the financial flows that goes into supporting and driving the key economic sectors today responsible for nature loss. First of all, agriculture, fishing, infrastructure, and then into extractives and forestry. Those are the big five, if you like, that for nature needs to transition to a nature positive kind of trajectory, and boosting green finance and green investments is fundamental, both private investment but also public through subsidies. Today, mostly supporting the old model, and the need to shift to support a nature positive and carbon neutral direction.
So what is success starting to look like? I mean, what are the nations of the world who have discovered progress on this? And even like at the project level, maybe things that WWF is involved in, what are some template successes that may be replicable in different parts of the world?
Well, great question, Eric, because it's true. There's so much happening. And I have to say, in many years of working in nature conservation, despite the indicators of the planet are all going still in the wrong direction, some cases even accelerating, I've never been more excited, because I begin to see the response, the awareness and the response. Actually, the science first, the awareness and the response to the issues. So we had a really interesting stress test, if you like, of the political willingness to embrace more ambition last September at the UNGA. 80 head of states, 80 head of states, plus the President of the European Union, all subscribed to a nature pledge that commits to reverse nature loss by 2030, exactly the global goal that I was mentioning earlier. That's exciting, because 80 head of states plus the whole Union of European Union, it's amazing. We never had nature so high at the political level. And that shows how it's perceived now to be relevant, not just nature conservation, not just anymore only a moral issue, so important for many of us, but also an economic issue, a development issue, in fact, an equity issue in moving forward. So this is exciting, and this, if you like, is a first indicator of what could come next year in 2021.
The pandemic itself is indirectly, possibly directly, you can make the case, a result of biodiversity loss and deforestation practices, and that ties into climate change as well. Are there permanent lessons, permanent messages that will come out of 2020 that unify, what to lay people who aren't in this every day may see as, those environmental issues, but like, how do you unify these tightly wound yet disparate issues and present them to a world that is very busy and has a lot to keep track of, and but still cares and wants to make progress?
Another great question. I think sadly, as humans, mostly we are a reactive species, so we are not particularly great in foreseeing the issues and taking preventative actions. And that's exactly what's sadly it's happening. I think most of the people are now really connecting much more than ever before, because before they were really treated separately: biodiversity loss, nature loss, and climate change, for example. Nature loss and climate change you've been seeing very often as separate topics. Now people are beginning to really connect the two. Forest fires, for example, that we have seen on TV in the Amazon, in Australia, even in the boreal regions of the world, have now, for example, triggered a massive response in the public, because they're seeing forests going up in smoke, but then smoke going up in the atmosphere. And so the connection between the destruction of nature, ecosystem, wildlife, koala burned alive, that we've seen Prime TV, is really helping people to make the connection. Unfortunately, we need those images, we need those crises to make this happen. But I think now that connection is much stronger than ever before. And even at political and corporate level, you keep hearing head of states, keep hearing Ministry of Finance, you keep hearing CEOs of big businesses connecting the nature loss and the climate change as the two sides of the same challenge that we need to address.
In many parts of the world, there are climate policies. In many other parts of the world, there are not climate policies, but the topic has entered the political mainstream. And in those places, I think people who aren't necessarily in the space will know that there are ways, policy levers to deal with climate change. You can have some kind of carbon pricing. You can have policies that support renewable energy. You can have building and efficiency standards. What are the complementary top-line levers that governments can reach for when they want to make their food systems more sustainable?
So it's not dissimilar, and I think the same levers apply to sustainable food system in balance with the planet. The whole system of subsidies to agriculture today is a system that needs to be reformed as deeply as the one on energy. And we're seeing, unfortunately, how difficult this is. There was a recent debate in European Parliament, and the European Union is one of the most progressive blocks of countries on these topics, environmental topics in many different ways. But on agriculture, the debate on the Parliament about reforming the common agricultural policy of the European Union, looking at the subsidy system, failed. Again, after so many times in the past decades, and this was just a few months ago. So we know that it's difficult, but we need to insist. The public public finance and incentive systems, as well as government regulation, is not changing and driving also private investment, sustainable food system will struggle to become truly sustainable. This is the big challenge. The big battle is about shifting financial flows from the old model, chemical and intensive agriculture, to regenerative agroecological agriculture and food production. That's the new shift, to really mimic, if you like, what's happening from fossil fuel to renewable energy.
Sometimes I think about the Sustainable Development Goals as a sort of scorecard for the whole world. And enshrined in the Sustainable Development Goals are really, it's a very comprehensive sort of etching into stone of the things that are important to the global community. And, many of them are hard to solve together, like population growth and nutrition and poverty, and sustainable, in the case of our conversation, agriculture. How do you see the Sustainable Development Goals as sort of a binding force? How are we doing on the Sustainable Development Goals that are most relevant to sustainable food systems? And where do you think we'll end up in 2030?
Yeah. So first of all, the Sustainable Development Goals are truly revolutionary in the way they've been conceived and intertwined, as you say, because the novelty of the Sustainable Development Goals approach compared to the past development approaches is the interconnection, is the fact that economic, social, and environmental goals are seen and are as interlinked and interdependent, which is exactly what it is. And that's why you actually see a lot of positive connections and multiple wins opportunities when you talk about several of these different goals. For the food system, I would say the environmental goals, the one about climate, the one about biodiversity and natural habitats, the one about fresh water, and the one about the ocean, because when you talk about food, we too often forget about the ocean. The ocean is a major component of the food systems today. Those four key development goals environmental ones, are fundamental to support a shift to a sustainable food production. Sustainable food production that, as a consequence, also have benefits to other social and economic goals. So the focus, as I said earlier, has to be on that pillar, the environmental pillar. This is where we are dramatically failing today in terms of food production. There are others, but this one, of course, is also the one we are focusing more as WWF, but it's clearly the area where we need to focus. We need more protection of habitats, stop losing nature. We need to invest in practices that are low footprint, ecological footprint, and that's the direction that next year, in the different conventions that we discussed earlier, is a chance to set all of us, government, corporates, civil society, consumers, on the same direction.
It's it's striking in conversations like this how every one of us is stuck between our limitations as people, as limitations in the communities we live in and the nations we live in, and vis-a-vis these intractable global problems, and it becomes very challenging right away to come up with an answer to the question, well, what can I do? So trying to, just think of a question that might be a good proxy for our viewers, like, what can anybody do? I mean, if people are inspired by your comments and want to bring awareness and progress to these issues, what do they do? They pick up the phone. Who do they call?
WWF. You can, but there is a lot that people can do in their own life. In fact, we are almost 8 billion on the planet, and each action time that number can be a major game changer. So never underestimate your own power as an individual, and so live sustainably. Live as low footprint as possible life in terms of the energy you use, the type of energy you consume, in terms of the food you consume. We just came out with an interesting report I will invite people to look up to. It's called Planetary Diets, planet-based diets, and it is about adapting our food and our diets to something that is nutritious, but at the same time has a low footprint. And it's possible. And interestingly, it changes country by country depending on different factors and variables, including cultural dimensions. And this is done by consumers around the world, allows to make food system more sustainable and also to address the issues of inequality in our food distribution and consumption that is still extremely high in the world, where part of the world is overconsumed over-consuming and wasting, and part of the world is still struggling with 700 million people malnourished today in the world, which is unacceptable. So there is a lot to do in the way we live our own lives. And then there's a lot to do in a way we actually make your voice heard. And I am a great supporter of this. Increasingly through social media, through congregation, aggregation, activism, whatever your preferred approach is, make your voice heard, support an agenda that is driving our society and economy to be sustainable versus climate, versus nature, and equality. And I think speaking up, aggregating, being a force for change, it's fundamental. Never give up on that. Join organization locally, globally, vote sensibly and wisely when you get to elect your leaders, and choose food from companies that are responsible and type of food that has low footprint, for example, on the environment.
We only have time for one last question, and I just kind of want to put it to you about your experience working in the space. People obviously don't become Director General of WWF International without having a real passion and persistence for conservation and for issues that are related to it, like the food system. Like, what is it for you that either got you started or that just keeps you going and engaged every day?
I've been reflecting on this because since I was a kid, I joined WWF when I was 12 years old as a young fundraiser. At the time, it probably would have been illegal. So today, it would have been illegal for me to raise money at that age, but I did. And then I moved on in other organizations, and I came back. But I think my main driver when I think about sustainability, because it's about justice. It's about justice and fairness. It's the way we're treating the planet. We're treating, as a consequence, ourselves. It's unfair. It's unjust, and we got to change this. And now we have the chance to do that because, frankly, it's not just a moral issue, as I said earlier, moral issue vis-a-vis nature, because nature has rights, and vis-a-vis people, because everybody has the right to a decent life on this planet. But it is also a question of really now beginning to feel the negative impact of our destructive, unsustainable, short-sighted development model. A model that has made great progress in the last 70, 80, 100 years. If you look at life expectancy, child mortality, extreme poverty, malnutrition, great progress on all these fronts. But now we're reaching a point where we are undermining the foundation of the development. That was the stability of our climate and the stability of our planet and natural systems and nature. And so by affecting that, we're risking not just to undermine all the progress done, but also to begin to be affected directly. And that's what I think gives me great hope that finally we'll get the lesson. We understand that the direction that we need to take is different from the one we've been taking in the last, particularly 100 years, and understand, stop taking nature for granted, and understand that we depend on nature much more than nature actually depends on us.
Thank you very much for your thoughts today. It's a pleasure to speak, and we all hope that 2021 will be a less harrowing, more productive year for everyone.
It must be. Thank you very much, Eric, for having me.